Welcome back, YouTubers. Well, today I think we're going to start trying something a little different. Not different in what I've been doing. What I've been doing in far as my filming is trying to keep things pretty specific. When I'm out here filming stuff, I don't like to bounce around between different projects, or it makes it confusing for you guys if I'm going to be, say, one day. I mean, I do a lot of different things in any given day, don't get me wrong, but I don't try and film everything, kind of muddle everything all together, because it's not fair to you guys. If there's something you like specifically, like, say, talking or working on chainsaws, fine. There's lots of you that like that, but there's also lots of you that probably don't. If I'm out doing something farming-wise, a lot of the guys that chainsaw stuff don't want to watch me moving hay bales or, feeding cattle, stuff like that. Coming up here in the summertime, there'll be probably a lot of farming content with me making hay, things like that. Those that are interested in the agricultural side will naturally gravitate towards that. Those that are interested in repair type videos, or my take on how to, another group of people will be interested in that format. The chainsaw nuts out there, they're going to like the saw stuff. So I'm trying to keep things categorized. And in doing so, I think I'm going to have to come up with a better description platform, just so you guys know what, kind of ahead of time what you're going to be watching. So you can choose if you like my content on a certain day of what I'm doing. Hey, great, you can watch that. If it doesn't interest you, come back another day and see what I'm doing. Because like I say, I do so many varied things from day to day, week to week, season to season, it changes. So, but anyways, today we're going to be talking a little bit about chainsaws again. And of course, one of my favorite subjects, and I'm sure it is for many of you. I think what we're going to call this, anything to do with saws or when I'm working on them, we'll just call it saw talkers. That's kind of what I think works. Anyways, we'll get right into it here. Today's topic. Today's saw that we're going to be talking about is the Husqvarna 346 XP and the different variants of these saws. This is a project saw that, actually, I think it was one of my last project saws that I've worked on, and it's been a while. I haven't actually been working on many saws lately. Mostly I've been collecting, because as any of you that work on any of these junk pile builds, or whatever you want to call it, or used saws, if most of the time when you get them, they're missing parts. So sometimes I spend a great deal of time tracking down or sourcing parts for these things, other wreck saws, or somebody that knows somebody that has something sitting on a shelf somewhere, or something even you find on eBay at a reasonable price. Now that's not always the case. eBay has become pretty pricey looking for parts for any, whether it be used or new old stock parts, things like that. But the odd time there is a deal that comes up, so it's not always feasible or affordable to jump into a project. Sometimes you have to collect for quite a while before you get needed components to put together a project. So, and this, when I did it, fortunately, it was pretty much, this saw was all complete. It was actually a 2-saw deal. I went to look at this saw, and the guy, turns out, had 2 of them. He had another one under the bench, even though he never mentioned it in his ad when he put it for sale. So, of course, it was, he says, well, if you're going to take this one, you might as well take both of them. And he made me a really good offer or price, and, well, basically I got 2 saws for the price of 1. So, and I did not have a whole lot into it. What was wrong with this one, they're actually both saws, actually a very low hour saw. It's got somewhat, I don't know, whatever you could say, road rash, so to speak, or, it was bouncing around the back of a pickup, so it's got bumps and scrapes and a little crack in the top cover here. But he had bought both saws brand new, he told me, and shortly after from the get-go, he said they never did run right. They always acted weird, and he figured they had an air leak. And he was smart enough not to keep running these saws, knowing that there was an issue. So he said he did never use them much. Spent most of the time sitting on a shelf in his shop. So lucky for me. Anyways, when I got home, I tore this one apart, and it turns out that the base gasket on the cylinder had a small, tiny little blowout spot, but that was where the air leak was coming from. These saws are notorious for having all these saws on this chassis, the 346, even the Farm and Ranch series, the plastic, like this is a magnesium case saw. It's a full-blown pro saw. It's these were the early. This is what they call an original edition, early iteration of these saws, which means it's a 42 millimeter top end, and which makes them 45 cc's. At least that's what Husqvarna has them listed as. There was two iterations of these saws: the 346 XP original edition, and then the 346 XP new edition, which had the upgraded larger bore top end from Husky, which I believe was 44.3 millimeter. You guys will correct me if I'm wrong. There was of course, the Husqvarna also had these in the red saws, as we all know, Johnson Red. The early edition or original edition 346 42 millimeter top end also crossed over into the Johnson Red. Sister saw to this would have been the 2147, I believe. Yes. The later new edition 346 XP with the 44.3 millimeter top end. The sister saw to that new edition would have been the Johnson Red 2153. Then, of course, they had like they always seem to have their full-blown XP Pro lines, and then they have a sort of like a detuned second line. In these early editions in the detuned second line, Husqvarna's would have been the 351, I believe. That also, they had an open port cylinder. The 346 had a full closed. These were a full closed port high performance cylinder. Any of you who work on saws, or any of you interested in saws, know that a closed port cylinder is always desired over an open port cylinder. Not that the open port cylinders are bad, they just don't, I don't know, they just don't seem to have quite that giddy up go that the closed port cylinders do. But anyways, like I say, the open port version of this would have been the 351. And the Johnson Red open port version was I believe the 2149. Yeah. In the new edition saws, like I say, you had the 346 XP large bore top end, and then they had in the Johnson Red, like I said, the 2153. In the newer series, when they had the 2153, they also had the detuned version of the Johnson Red, and that would have been known as the 2152, and that would have been equivalent to in the new edition Huskies, that would have been, they had the 346 XP and the 44.3 millimeter top end, and the sister saw, or the detuned saw of that version would have been the 353, and the Johnson Red sister saw to that would have been the 2152. Anyways, this saw, the internals of it were like brand new, other than, like I say, the cylinder. I found that it had a blown base gasket. Piston was in excellent shape. Cylinder was absolutely mint. There was, not a scuff or scrub on it whatsoever. So, and these are getting hard. The original edition ones are getting hard to find. Original top end. You can easily upgrade these to the 44.3 millimeter top end from the new edition ones. I think they pretty much bolt on with basically no modifications necessary. The intake track on these, the carburation. This is, it was an EL18 on here. They use those in a whole whack of, both in the Farm and Ranch series, like the 350s, the 345s. They crossed over into the Johnson Red, the 2150, which was a plastic crankcase saw as well, and 2145. All those Farm and Ranch saws, they used a lot of the parts compatibility on these saws. There's a lot of good crossovers. The ignition coils you can use, I think, throughout pretty much that whole series in the early editions. Late editions, it was the same thing. You can everything crosses over. Like in the early editions here, the internal guts of your recoil, your springs, your starter pawls, your pulleys, ignition coil, gas tank, carburation. So many of these are you can interchange parts within the models, and even in between the, other than the plastics being different color, you can between, if you know which saws in the Johnson Red line, you can mix and match parts, so to speak. And so it's pretty good if you're a tinkerer, like guys like me that collect these things for, you can find all kinds of wrecked. It doesn't have to be a full, if you're building a pro saw, you don't have to have the actual another exact matching saw, as long as you knew in that series which saws there were shared parts. Early pre-EPA 345s, for example, I believe, I've checked the part numbers, they have the same ignition coils, the same recoil parts. I think even the whole recoil assembly will fit on here. Only difference is the sticker. Gas tank is the same, carburetor is the same. Of course the top end is totally different, because that's a plastic clamshell saw, as they call them. Your cylinder is partly bossed, the bottom is bossed and supports the crankshaft, so totally different platform in that regard. But so many of these other parts interchange. Obviously things like fuel caps and oil caps and chain brake handles and all kinds of stuff. Handlebars are different on 350s. I think share the same handle, but the smaller 2140, or sorry, the 345s and the Johnson Red 24, of course, are different again. But handles, of course, were different. But as far as so many of the other aspects of them, you could share parts. So it made working on these fun. Now I will say the early edition 42mm top ends on these are no longer available. You cannot get you can't get cylinder kits for them anymore, and even when they were available, they were prohibitively expensive. Pistons, I do believe you can still get. 42mm piston, interestingly enough, on these 346s are also the same piston on the 345 and the Johnson Red 2145. You can share the. Those are why they're still available, because they were widely used in so many different models, and even in some of their larger weed whackers and brushing saws, clearing saws. If it had a 42mm top end in that year range, don't ask me which models, I never dug into that. But I know they did share some of the same pistons. So if your original edition cylinder is in good shape, you can definitely, if you can find a decent, well, either a good used piston out of one of these wrecked other saws, or if you're lucky enough to get a good price on a new piston. Or there is a lot of aftermarket options, and I'm not just talking about Highway or Farmer Tech. I know Meteor builds a very good quality piston for these as well, so you can breathe new life into these old saws. This little saw has become, kind of the last year and a half since I built it, has become, well, my favorite go-to saw for limbing hairy spruce and pine. That, like where I live, we have a lot of that here, so. It's a very small, very light, robust design. If you look after them like any saw, these were actually considered to be more desirable by a lot of guys than the new edition 346s. These things are screamers. They run hard right from the factory out of the get-go. They had, from what I understand, pretty aggressive timing numbers on them, so made them a real performer. They're not, don't get me wrong, like this is a 45cc saw. It doesn't have the great lugging power, so to speak, but they still pull surprisingly well for what they are. Now this, being that I was doing it on a budget and I wanted to see what I could come up with, seeing it was basically a complete saw. I know I put a new fuel filter. I think I changed the fuel line in it. I don't remember if I changed the intake boot. Like I said, these all these series, these 300 series Huskies and the small 2100 series John Sureds, they all had problems with their intake boots leaking on them. And if any of you have owned these or worked on them, you know exactly what I'm talking about. As in, they've got a poor design. They had a plastic snap clamp on the cylinder that your intake boot would go onto, and those with time would dry out or expand a little bit, and then it would create a slow air leak. And a lot of these saws died an early death because, well, guys just kept tuning around it and adjusting the carburetor and trying to whatchamacallit, and the saw would run lean, and they'd keep running it like that, and well, eventually they'd cook them or blow them up. So this one, like I say, the guy was smart enough. He didn't. He knew something was off with it. It had an air leak. It wasn't the intake boot. Like I say, it turned out it was the base gasket on the cylinder that was leaking. So in true farmer fashion, my local dealers that are available to me are, well, a bit of a drive. Like, I don't live just 5 or 10 minutes down the road from a major city or center here. Like, we're a 45-minute drive out. Some people live a lot further than that, but for me, that's at the cost of gas nowadays. If you phone and order for parts, you're not going to town every day. Like, for here, it's I go to town maybe once every 2-3 weeks or whatever. And if you got something you want to work on, and you need parts, you're going to be waiting. So that's why you end up, if you're a saw collector, you've got several projects on the go, because you're always seems to be, you order a part and then you wait for 3 weeks to get it, and then it's another 2 weeks before you get into town to pick it up. So at that point, well, you're sometimes a month or 2 months before you get back to a project. So, but anyways, like I say, in typical farmer fashion, when I was putting the cylinder back on, I made my own homemade base gasket, which was technically half the thickness of the original factory gasket. Now, they were pretty generous with the gaskets on these as far as, thickness goes. They were, pretty heavy or pretty thick. So your piston to cylinder clearance at the top of the cylinder is, in certain cases leaves a lot to be desired in certain saws. This one was, one of those that had a fair bit of clearance. So I didn't want to remove the gasket completely. I made my own, and laugh at me if you will, but I think it was out of like one of these reinforced holiday cards. So I didn't even use a gasket maker like McCord gasket or something like that. What I did was, like I say, literally cut one out of an old greetings card that was kind of that heavy, stringy reinforced paper, but it was I measured it was half the thickness of the factory standard base gasket. That being said, I didn't just put the gasket in there alone. I did seal it with Moto Seal, the 2-stroke small engine. It's not an RTV sealant, it's way better than that, because if you're working any of these saws, do not use any of the silicone based products like any like the high temperature orange red or ultra black, or any of the, doesn't matter what brand, if it's Permatex or 3M or any of the other ones, but you have to use a very specific like Permatex that I use. Theirs is called Moto Seal. Lots of other saw builders on YouTube, they'll tell you the same to use it. Some guys used 3Ms, I think it's called 3-Bond. Any of the 2-stroke sealer, like even from the Yamaha or Honda, like the Honda Bond or Yama Bond, it's all designed to be exposed to fuel like gasoline, because gasoline is a very good solvent at dissolving a lot of things, and silicone is no different. Any of those silicone-based stuff do not tolerate that. You'll get away with it for a little bit, but then they'll start leaking. So, anyways, I put a light coating of Moto Seal on both sides of the gasket, sealed the cylinder back down. The one thing on this saw was the muffler was all, for whatever reason, the guy told me, I think him and his nephew were cutting some wood, and his nephew dropped a big tree limb or something on the front of the saw and smashed the muffler all to hell, basically. So, and at the time, I simply didn't have a muffler available. I wanted to get the saw going. It was the only thing that was holding me up at that point. I had the saw all back together. So, you guessed it, I built my own, I forget what the exact diameter of the pipe is. I think it's like 1/8 or something by, I forget the length. Most guys have a single outlet on here. As you can see, a double outlet on it, sort of like a double barrel shotgun special. I don't know if I really have if it's quite big enough. Like, this is too 2 3/8 medium wall pipe, and that's all I had at the time. Like I'd literally, when I did this, it was late winter. Of course, everybody that's on a farm or a saw builder or any of us guys or whatever that tinker with stuff, you usually have a scrap pile behind the workshop that you, various tubes and pipes and whatever, but everything was buried and I couldn't find anything, and this is all I had in the shop. So I used 2 3/8 for the outlet, but I feel that it's not probably quite. I mean, 2 3/8 equates to what, 3/4 of an inch. So that's roughly 3/4 of your outlet. Your exhaust, the exhaust port. I did the math or whatever, and this works out to roughly 3/4 of the capacity of your exhaust outlet. So you have to have a little bit of back pressure. I probably could have got it somewhere closer to a 1 inch. And I think it would have been a little bit happier. It seems to, like these pipes, if you're not careful when you're building them, well, either they work or they don't work. This one actually works pretty good in a certain RPM range. For light limbing, it howls like a bugger, runs good, and for pulling in the cut, it really pulls. Like if you get them right, they work surprisingly well, and this does. Like if you dog in and you're bucking even for a small saw, it surprised me compared to, I had borrowed a muffler off of one of my other saws, but I needed my other saw. So like I say, at the time this was kind of just a test bed. This saw was not proven itself yet, so of course the muffler ended up going back onto my other saw, so I still needed to come up with something in the meantime. So this is what I came up with, but it can change the run characteristics of the saw quite a bit. And what I mean by that is certain RPM ranges you'll have a better power band or whatever if you get it right or don't get it right. And I've got it close, but I'm not quite happy with it. What I'm talking about is kind of in the mid-range in your power band. When you first start cutting the log, it acts like it's kind of, I don't know how to explain it. It's kind of like a gargle, like it's rich, but it's not. It's just these pipes change your like I say, the run characteristic of the saw. Overall, I'm happy with it. It almost acts like a rev limiter, like some of these newer Stihl 500Is that you hear guys complaining about. When you get in the cut, they open up and they boogie. But when you're just doing kind of light cutting, they kind of want to hang back or gargle, so to speak. And this kind of almost acts the same way. Although it's not, this does not have any kind of a rev limiter, and these didn't have limited coils on them. So pipes, if you get them right, like I say, they should work well throughout the RPM range. This one, not quite. Freeload RPM or very light cutting, like small limbing, it sings along wonderful. But when you get just into like a medium light, like a medium cut, that's where you kind of notice like a funny gargle. But when you dog it in and you're really cutting, then it really shines. Like this thing pulls hard for a little 45cc saw. It is amazing. She really chugs along. To add to the test bed, so to speak, or the experiment, I decided to try out one of these new, well, I guess not new now, they've been out for a while in the market, but one of these Stihl Light 04 bars. Now they're a thin curve bar, and you're supposed to run their new thin curve chain, which is these 23 RS Pro chains, and this seems to have been a good fit on here. It's a supposed to be 16-inch bar, but it's actually more like a 15-inch bar. Still small mount bar system. What I mean by that, that's used on their smaller homeowner series saws. It would be what they call a 3005 mount. That would be like a sub 261, 260, 026. Anything smaller than that would have these 3005 mounts. Anything that's 026 and bigger has what everybody knows as the 3003 series mounts, which you can run them in 325 or full 3/8. Interestingly enough, in the Stihl the 3005 bar mount has the same slot size or bar stud size as the Husqvarna small bar mount, for any of you that are curious. So yes, you can put these still small bar mounts to a Husky small bar mount. It can be done, and you don't need to do a whole lot of modification. All I had to do was file out my adjuster slot hole just a little bit bigger with a chainsaw file, and it drops right on. Your oiler holes do line up. That's fine. The only difference is you'll have to either get somebody to make you a custom chain, or I know you can buy from Stihl. I know they do have pre-made chains in a certain length. When these bars are mounted to the Stihl small saws like the MS 250, 251s, and smaller like 211s and stuff like that, and to 230s, they run a 62 link driver link chain. But because it's on the Husky, and the Husky drive sprocket is just a little bit further, literally a hair back further than the Stihl is, a 62 link chain is too short. You're gonna have to, I've got a 64 link chain on here, and I made this chain myself because I have a breaker and a spinner. So I just bought a longer, I don't know what it was, a Stihl 67 drive link for one of the other longer bars, or a 72 for a 72 drive link for like an 18-inch bar, and I just broke it and you know, shortened it and turned it into a 64. So you can put these bars on a Stihl small bar mount onto a Husky small bar mount saw. The only difference is you're going to have to, like I say, run a custom chain or get a saw shop to make you a 64 driver instead of a 62 driver. This is a full 325, but like I say, they are what they call the thin kerf, which means they cut a little, well, your cut is a little narrower. So yeah, it doesn't pull as hard on the saw, and I guess that's why it works so good on a small 45cc saw like this, which coincidentally on like a Stihl MS250, even though that's not a pro saw, it's a farm and ranch saw or homeowner saw, whatever you want to call it. You know, they're also a 45cc saw. Although guys, I know, hop them up, import them, and do all kinds of crazy stuff with the old 250s and even some of the old 025s, which were, you know, actually for what they were pretty good saws too. But anyways, hope you guys found this maybe somewhat interesting. I don't know. I've, again, rambled on way too long, but anyways, thanks for stopping by and checking out this video, and till the next time, anyways, we're gonna get this saw out in the wood. I gotta do a bunch of cutting here in the next, spring is finally here now. Everything is, as you can see, yes, the ice and snow is melting and disappearing, and spring has finally come, so we're starting to get into our spring break up here. So I got a lot of firewood to cut, and this saw this past winter has done a lot of cutting for me. I've spent a lot of time limbing, like I say, limbing and topping trees with it, and it's become one of my, like I say, almost one of my favorite little go-to saws. Not that I'm a particular to any one brand, whatchamacallit, Johnsted actually has always been my saw of choice. Husqvarna now in the last few years, since Johnsted is no more, Husqvarna discontinued them a few years back, so now I've sort of migrated to some of the other brands, Husqvarna being the closest, of course, or whatever, the sister brand. And yes, I even have a bunch of Stihl saws now that I've been collecting and building, and we'll get into that at another day. But anyways, till next time, take care. You know what, just for fun,